Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Irish Wildlife Trust webinar. This is our webinar series all about the nature restoration law, and this evening we have a focus on the marine elements of the nature restoration law. That's what we'll be chatting about. Just at the top of the call, to let you know a few general bits and pieces about the Irish Wildlife Trust webinars. My name is Kieran Flood. I'm the General Manager here at the Irish Wildlife Trust, and I'll be hosting this evening. We'll be finishing the webinar around about 7 o'clock, so we'll be with you for an hour. As it's a webinar, we'll have a Q&A, so you can ask some questions as you go along. We'll have some presentations from our two guests, Grace and Donal. And then we'll have time for a Q&A after the presentations. So there's a Q&A function you'll see at the bottom of your screen where you can pop in your questions. Just to make it easier for us to keep an eye on them and read them, if you could keep your questions reasonably short, just so it's easier for us to monitor them in this function there. There's also a chat function where you can chat amongst yourselves or really just put in comments that you want us to read later or read now. But if you have a specific question for one of our panelists, do use the Q&A function, because we'll be looking at that for questions after the talks. Okay, so a little bit about the Irish Wildlife Trust. We're a non-government organisation and a charity founded in 1979. And what we do is we work to create a better future for biodiversity in Ireland by motivating and supporting people to take action to help protect and restore biodiversity. So that's what we do. We do that in a few different ways. Advocacy and campaigning will be one of our main activities, but we also do general sort of public engagement with nature and ideas of how to help nature. So we do walks and talks around the country with our network of fantastic volunteer-led local branches, in-person walks and talks. And we also do webinars, for example, to spread good ideas about how we can protect and restore nature. So that's the Irish Wildlife Trust. We're a membership-based charity. So if you like the talk this evening, or you just generally like what we do, feel free to pop onto our website and join our organization. So that's who you're with tonight. And I think that's all the housekeeping done, really. So there's a Q&A for people to use at home. We won't be able to probably get to every question in the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can before 7 o'clock. Grand. So I will just quickly hand you over to our panelists to say a quick hello before we start some presentations. Grand. So Grace, you want to say hi there?
So hello, everyone. My name is Grace Carr, and I'm the Marine Advocacy Officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust.
Hi everyone, my name is Donal Griffin. I'm the Fair Seas Campaign Coordinator, so I work very closely with Grace and with Kieran as well. And just to say, Fair Seas is a coalition of leading environmental NGOs and networks in Ireland with a specific focus and interest in marine protected areas, but also more generally healthy, happy seas and building a movement for ocean stewardship in Ireland. But more on that later. Thank you.
And we're delighted that Donal and Grace made time to chat with us this evening. So what we're going to do is we'll get stuck in. As I mentioned, the theme for the evening is framed by the nature restoration law, which is a hugely important piece of European law that fought its way over the line and into existence recently, which is good news. So we're going to have a presentation from Grace introducing the nature restoration law and the marine elements of it. It's a large and important law, and will definitely affect the marine environment and hopefully in a positive manner. So we'll hear from Grace on that, and then we'll also hear from Donal, looking a little bit more closely at the MPAs and the MPA designation and things happening in that space in Ireland. So I will hand you over to Grace if you just want to share your presentation.
Yeah. Now, can everyone see that okay?
It's in presentation mode and it looks good. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thanks, Grace.
Okay. So hello, everyone. Yeah, so like I said, my name's Grace. And yeah, so we were working on the nature restoration law in the Irish Wildlife Trust for the past couple of years, advocating and lobbying to try and get the best possible law that we could for people and nature. So the main sort of targets the overall arching targets for the nature restoration law is to have 20% of EU land and 20% of EU seas restored by 2030. And then there's an aim to try and get all habitats that are in need of restoration restored by 2050. So this is then broken down even further into member states and to different habitats. So member states have to ensure that 30% of the total area of degraded habitats are restored by 2030. This then increases up to at least 60% by 2040 and at least 90% by 2050 on all degraded habitats. So this presentation is going to focus in on the marine sections of the nature restoration law, and it's Article 5 within the law if anyone actually wants to go and have a wee look at the text. But within the marine section, it's habitats in the marine ecosystems are split into 7 main groups. So I'm going to go into these main groups briefly and talk about why they're important to be restored and some of the main stressors that will have to be taken into consideration. And then I'm also going to talk about other aspects within the marine section, such as data collection and protection of offshore sites. So the first habitat that's included in the nature restoration law is seagrass beds. So this is not only just a really important habitat forming species, it's also extremely important when it comes to climate mitigation. So even though seagrass only covers less than 0.1% of the global seafloor, it helps to store somewhere between 10 and 18% of global ocean carbon. So extremely important. And in Ireland, we've got 2 main species of seagrass that can be found. And there's lots of volunteer conservation groups around the country that work really closely on seagrass, trying to protect it and restore what we have. So actually having these legally binding obligations to restore a seagrass habitat is a very welcome addition in the law. So one of the best ways to actually restore seagrass would be through passive restoration. And that's basically whenever you take away the stressors. So actually actively restoring seagrass by going out and physically planting seagrass takes quite a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of money. And there's no guarantee that it'll actually work. So having passive restoration where you remove stressors is one of the best ways to guarantee that we can get our seagrass beds into good ecological condition. So it's quite a sensitive habitat as well. One of the main stressors on seagrass would be from bad water quality and pollution. So coming from sewage or agricultural runoff. So in order to ensure that we have healthy seagrass, we need to look at these different stressors and take into account what's going on in our freshwater ecosystems and on our land-based ecosystems as well. So the second habitat that's included is macroalgae. So this is basically just different species of seaweed. So there are around 550 species of seaweed that have been identified in Irish waters. And the waters around Ireland and the UK are very globally significant when it comes to seaweed biodiversity, because our waters actually hold around 6% of seaweed biodiversity in the globe. So, and this could be because of where we're actually situated. So we're at the kind of northern limits for some of the warmer water species of seaweed, and we're at the southern limits of colder water species of seaweed. So that could be why we have such biodiverse seaweed in our waters. So protecting macroalgae and seagrass beds is not just important for the environment and ecosystems, it's also ecologically important as well, because a lot of fish species and crustacean species will use these areas as areas to spawn or as nursery areas for their young. So if there is a commercially important fish species that is reliant on these macroalgae beds for their juveniles to be able to mature, it's economically important for the fishing industry to ensure that we have good quality, sustainable macroalgae beds as well. So the third habitat is shellfish beds. So these are otherwise known as biogenic reefs, and they're made up from different species of bivalves. So this can be, you know, oysters, scallops, clams, different mussels, different things like that. And they offer a wide range of ecosystem services. They're not only an important habitat, they also help to dampen wave energy, so they help against coastal erosion. And they're also very good at improving water quality. So because a lot of bivalves are filter feeders, they'll make the water quality in the area better. So this would benefit other species in the area, such as seagrass, which needs to have good water quality to be able to thrive. So it benefits not just itself, but other ecosystems surrounding it. So the fourth group included is marl beds. So marl is like a coralline algae that ends up forming into like a hard seaweed. And it does this because as it grows, it deposits lime in its cell walls, and then it forms these beautiful kind of spiky beds. So marl is generally found kind of in coastal inlets and bays, and it's a very sensitive habitat. It can be damaged very easily. One of the main pressures on marl beds would be destructive fishing gear. So any type of fishing gear that sort of gets caught in the marl or drags along the marl is going to break it. And also, if there's fishing activity that disturbs the seabed, so things like bottom trawling, if that's going on close to marl, it disturbs the sediment, which rises up into the water column and then can settle on the marl beds. So this is called sedimentation, and it has really damaging effects on the marl. So again, passive restoration is important to restore these areas. So removing the pressures from the area so that they can just naturally recover. Now, the fifth habitat is sponge, coral, and cartilaginous beds. So it used to be that everyone just thought of tropical waters whenever they thought of coral, but I think most of us know now that there is lots and lots of cold water corals. And actually more than half of the world coral species are cold water species. And through surveys that have been done in Ireland's marine waters, we have a lot of cold water corals here that we need to protect. And sponge as well. We've got around 290 species of sponge described in Irish waters. And this is a really welcome addition to the law as well, because sponge isn't specifically mentioned within the Habitats Directive. Reef habitats are mentioned within it, but sponge isn't specifically there. So having it specifically mentioned is very welcome. Now, the sixth habitat that we have are vents and seeps. So this would be hydrothermal vents and cold water seeps. So these are very unique and important habitats because the gases that are coming out of these vents and seeps end up changing the chemistry and the sedimentation around them, and they can form these beautiful, unique kind of underwater structures. And these structures are, important habitat for all these really unique and endemic species that mightn't be found anywhere else. So very important to protect these just to improve biodiversity. And the last group that's included in the nature restoration law is soft sediments. So soft sediments would include sand, mud, and everything in between, muddy sand, sandy mud. And these are a widespread habitat type. So within the nature restoration law, a widespread habitat type is anything that is greater than 10,000 kilometers squared. So because this is a widespread habitat type, it's actually subject to lower restoration thresholds than the previous 6 habitats, which I just talked about. So it doesn't have to have 30% restored by 2030. It's going to be a lower threshold. Now, this hasn't been decided yet, but it does state within the law that member states, when they are setting this threshold, it still has to be high enough to ensure that good environmental condition is going to be met for these soft sediments. So they're a really important ecosystem as well. A lot of soft sediments are very dynamic. They're constantly shifting and moving. So they're really interconnected with coastal habitats and habitats on land like dune systems. The sands are constantly moving around. And the biodiversity that's found in soft sediments, like some of the invertebrates and all that are within soft sediments, are very important in the nutrient cycling within the ocean ecosystem as well. So we need to ensure that even though it's going to be a lower threshold, it still has to be high enough to make sure that it's in good environmental condition. So those are the 7 habitats that are included within it. And member states not only have to ensure that they are restoring these areas, they actually have to re-establish these habitats where they've been lost as well. So there are thresholds for this. They have to use any historical data that they have and any baseline data that we have on these different habitats to find out how much we've actually lost and where these habitats were previously found. And then by 2030, have 30% of that restored, and by 2040, 60%. And by 2050, having 100% as well. So this is in order for these habitats to be able to reach their favourable reference area. And favourable reference area basically just means that the area of the habitat is large enough that it is able to basically perform all the ecosystem's functions that it's naturally designed to do, like carbon sequestration, preventing coastal erosion, helping with the water quality, things like that. and so that it's a stable and self-sustaining environment as well, and that it's able to support all the different communities of species that rely on this habitat. So within the nature restoration law as well, they have a full annex identifying specific species which need to be considered. So this is also, there are species included in the Habitats Directive, but the list of species in the Habitats Directive is missing quite a lot. So it was really good to see that in the nature restoration law, they have got a new list, and this list actually includes around 20 species of elasmobranch. So these are our cartilaginous fishes, so sharks, skates, rays, and chimeras. And they also have other commercially important fish like salmon and sea trout in there as well. And member states must put in place restoration measures for the habitats of these species and ensure that all their ecological needs are met. So this was really welcome to see because, as we all know, elasmobranchs, they're very vulnerable species. A lot of sharks are very long-lived. They don't mature until late in life, and a lot of them only give birth or lay a few eggs. So ensuring that their habitats are safe and restored is very important for the conservation of these species. And then when it comes to the commercially important species, like salmon and trout, a lot of these species will spawn in freshwater ecosystems. So again, this is showing how if we want to effectively restore their habitats, so for the conservation of them, we can't just look at the marine, we also have to look at the freshwater areas that they use as well. So there's another section in the law that looks at data collection. So member states must prioritise finding out the overall area and the status of each habitat type. So this is an issue that's not just within Ireland, it's an issue all around the world that we don't have enough data on our habitats and our species. And there are thresholds that have been set within the law. For land-based targets, the thresholds are actually higher because it is easier to get data on land. But for the marine habitats, which we spoke about there, by 2030, 50% of the habitats from groups 1 to 6 must be known by 2030, with 100% known by 2040. And then for group 7, it's again set at a slightly lower threshold because it's such a widespread habitat. So 50% of the area and status of our soft sediments must be known by 2040, with 100% known by 2050. So again, this is a really welcome addition to the law because it's always a problem that we don't have enough data. We don't know the status of the area and we don't know what damage different activities will do. So having this legal obligation to collect data and have it included in their national restoration plans is very welcome. So this diagram that I have there is taken from a report done by National Parks and Wildlife Service back in 2019. And it's showing the overall status of Irish habitats, which are listed under the Habitats Directive. So this includes land-based habitats as well. It's not just marine. But as you can see, 39% of habitats are in bad condition, 46% are in an adequate condition, and only 15% are actually in favourable condition. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring all our habitats back up into favourable and good environmental status. So lastly, within the marine section of the nature restoration law, there is an article which looks at how to protect our offshore areas. So this article is Article 18 within the nature restoration law, if you just want to have a look. And basically, once you go past 12 nautical miles away from the coast, you're entering into offshore waters. And member states can't just designate management measures in these offshore waters nationally. They have to go through an EU process. And this process is known as joint recommendations, and it's done through the Common Fisheries Policy. So this image that I have there, this is taken from a report from Seas at Risk, the Marine Conservation Society, and Oceana, and Irish Wildlife helped with this report. And it was basically looking at bottom trawling in EU waters and vessels over 18 meters. So anything there that you can see that is pink or purple is showing where bottom trawling is happening with these larger vessels in our offshore waters. And the areas that are outlined in black is showing our existing protected sites. So as you can see, there's bottom trawling occurring in these protected sites. And this could be happening with Irish vessels and other EU member states vessels as well. So if Ireland decided that they wanted to actually put in management measures within these protected sites, they would have to initiate the joint recommendation process. And to do this, they need to collect evidence. So evidence on the site, why it needs to be protected and what management measures need to be put in place. And they need to present this to the European Commission, as well as the other member states that have fishing rights in the area. Now, the other member states are able to object to this, and it's the Commission's job then to facilitate the whole process and make sure that a management plan agreement is come to. But unfortunately, over the last 10 years since this was brought in, not many joint recommendations have been progressed. So this is what the article in the nature restoration law is about. It's just getting more of these joint recommendations put in place so that we can all start effectively protecting our offshore areas. So within this article, it states that if there are any of the habitats that need to be restored in member states' waters, then they need to put in joint recommendations. And they have put a timeline in it as well. So at the very latest, to put in these joint recommendations, it can be no later than 18 months before the respective threshold. So if they're going for the 2030 target, then halfway through 2028 is the very latest that member states can put in for their joint recommendations. So this was a really welcome addition to the law, and we did actually fight quite a lot to get this included within it, just because it's an important way to be able to protect our offshore areas, and having these timelines put in place and more coherence between these different EU laws will help to make sure that member states start utilising the process. So what are some of the ways that Ireland can hit their marine targets? So one of the ways that they'll be able to do it will be effectively managing our existing Natura 2000 network. So this is our network of protected sites. So our special areas of conservation and our special protection areas. So we already discussed joint recommendations, and that will be important for our offshore sites. But within our inshore sites, we've got well over 200 marine protected areas inshore. But unfortunately, while these are designated, a lot of them aren't actually implemented very well, and a lot of them are missing site-specific management plans with specific conservation objectives to hit. So if we want to actually hit our targets, we're going to have to put in better management plans and initiate fisheries Natura declarations as well. So these fishery Natura declarations are able to restrict certain damaging fishing activities in certain areas. So that's one way that we'd be able to do it, but that wouldn't be enough, because our existing network of Natura 2000 sites doesn't actually cover all of the habitats that are included within the nature restoration law. So we'd have to establish new areas for restoration or for protection. And this is where the new Marine Protected Area Bill is going to be vitally important. So I'm not going to talk very much about that, because Donal's going to be speaking about the Marine Protected Area Bill. But basically, this bill needs to take into account our new restoration targets within the nature restoration law. And one very important aspect of it would be having a strictly protected threshold contained within the law as well. Because having strict protection is basically just having passive restoration as well, which is what we spoke about at the start, and how it's very important for certain marine habitats. Sometimes the best way to restore them is just by leaving them alone and letting them come back themselves. So aside from ensuring that we increase our marine protected areas and manage the network better, we can't just focus on what to do in the actual marine environment, because everything's connected, and we need to ensure that there's coordination with terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems as well. Because like I mentioned at the start there, water quality is very important for different habitats in the marine ecosystem. So we need to ensure that there's compliance with environmental legislation. Ireland has got a lot of regulations, but unfortunately it doesn't generally comply with them all the time. So we need to improve on that. And we also need to review existing legislation that isn't fit for purpose. So, even for example, last week with the new Water Action Plan, there's an obligation within that for a review of the Arterial Drainage Act, which is going to hopefully greatly improve our freshwater ecosystems, which is then going to have a knock-on effect to our coastal and marine ecosystems as well. So we need to ensure that there's a full island sort of look at our ecosystems when it comes to putting in our measures for hitting our marine targets. So that's everything from me then. I'm going to pass it over to Donal so he can tell us a bit more about the Marine Protected Area Bill.
Thanks a million, Grace. That was really interesting. Seems like the nature restoration laws sounds pretty good. Plugging a lot of gaps in the existing EU laws and generally attempting to make it all work much better for nature. So probably have a few questions about that later on in the talk. But we'll let Donal come in now. Thanks for joining us, Donal, and yeah, work away with your talk.
Very much, Kieran. Thank you very much, Grace. That was really useful. Even for me, that has tried to stay up to date with the ups and downs of the nature restoration law journey. It's easier said than done. So thank you for that. Can you see my presentation there? Okay.
Yeah, I can see it fine
okay,
here.
great. Thumbs up. Brilliant. Thanks. So hi again, everyone. So as I said earlier, my name is Donal Griffin. I'm the Fair Seas Campaign Coordinator. The title of my talk here today, Ireland's Fair Seas, on our way to 30% marine protected areas by 2030, question mark. And that question mark is quite important. We'll try to answer that question maybe together through the next few slides, just over the next maybe 15 minutes. And just to reiterate again who Fair Seas are, so we are a coalition of Ireland's leading environmental NGOs and networks, and you can see our partners there, Irish Wildlife Trust at the front and the top there. So I work quite closely with Grace and Kieran and the other coalition partner colleagues that I'm very lucky to work with. And our ambition as a campaign project is to see Ireland become a leader in marine protection, giving our species, habitats and coastal communities, and that's a really important aspect of our work, coastal communities the opportunity to thrive. And we're also funded, our funders are there, we're funded by 4 different international ocean conservation grant giving organizations. So we're very lucky to have their support here in Ireland over this past 3 and more years now at this stage. So just a quick outline of what the key messages, I guess. I'll put them up front and center. The first one, take-home message for me, is that I'll get into. Ireland's marine area is enormous, and its stewardship by successive governments has failed to deliver its full ecological, its full economic or full social potential. That's in the Fair Seas view. And I'll try to explain why we have that view in the next slides. That the quantity and the quality of Ireland's current marine protected area network is poor. And because it's so poor, in our view, that the transformational change is needed. Thirdly, that the Irish government is drafting new marine protected area legislation as we speak. So it's actually quite an exciting time for Irish marine conservation, and potentially the MPA legislation, when we do get it, the forthcoming bill, and when it is passed into law, has the opportunity to shape and guide how marine conservation is conducted in Ireland for decades to come. So it is quite an exciting time, and it's a really formative time for Ireland's seas, the health of Ireland's seas in a way. And then I'll address more directly then the question that I posed, is Ireland on its way to designate 30% of its seas by 2030? And spoiler alert, I think the answer is yes to that. But I have a few caveats and reservations as well that I'll get onto. So first of all, this is the real map of Ireland, published by the Marine Institute first, I think, maybe 20 years ago or more now, Faragina Éireann. And it's just to kind of reiterate the size of our marine jurisdiction. We're actually one of the largest, by size, one of the largest member states, if you include of the European Union, if you include our sea jurisdiction. 10 times the size of our landmass, over 488,000 kilometers squared we're responsible for. This includes our territorial waters closer to shore, or EEZ further off, beyond the 12 nautical mile that Grace mentioned, and also parts of the continental shelf as well, beyond the 200 nautical mile limit. So Ireland has a duty and a responsibility to look after, in various guises, to look after this vast marine area, and it is a vast responsibility in itself. I think that's important to remember. And then also marine protected areas, another just kind of a reminder of what exactly is a marine protected area. And this is a really useful definition. I think it comes from the Expanding Ireland's Marine Protected Area Network report that was published in 2020. So a marine, and this is the definition that Fair Seas work to as well. So a marine protected area is a geographically defined area of marine character or influence which is protected through legal means, and I think that's important, that legal means aspect, for the purpose of the conservation and or restoration, that's another important aspect, specific purpose of conservation and or restoration of species, habitats, or ecosystems, as well as their associated ecosystem services, processes, and cultural values. And third important piece in this is managed with the intention of achieving stated conservation objectives. So we'll keep that in mind now, that definition, as we go through the next slides. And just as a reminder of the 30 by 30 that I've mentioned already, and I know Grace has mentioned it too, but as a reminder, so this 30 by 30, the 30% by 2030, is the target of achieving 30% of land and sea in a protected area by 2030. And when we talk about sea specifically, leaving the terrestrial side of things aside for this evening, Ireland's 30 by 30 marine protected area commitments are quite strong in a way, and they are similar to other EU member states and around the world. So we're not lacking when it comes to commitments, because Ireland has actually committed to protecting 30% of its waters in a protected area by 2030 at a national level through the Programme for Government and multiple government announcements and speeches in that sense. At an EU level through the EU Biodiversity Strategy, which mentions 30 by 30, as well as the newer EU Commission MPA pledge. Minister Dara O'Brien committed to 30 by 30 back in October 2023 through that process that was they had a meeting hosted in Dublin, and also globally through the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, so COP15 back in December 2022, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity COP. So it's very clear from Ireland's commitments what they want to do, but the commitments are easy to make, but let's have a look at their progress. This is something that Fair Seas keeps a close eye on. And when we talk about the progress of MPAs in Ireland, I tend to, and Fair Seas tend to talk about two different things, connected but different things. The quantity and the quality of Ireland's MPAs are important to be mindful of. And in terms of quantity, first of all, Ireland's current marine protected area network consists primarily of Natura 2000 sites, the sites that Grace had mentioned. So SACs under the Habitats Directive, SPAs under the Birds Directive. So special areas of conservation and special protection areas are two types of MPAs, and MPAs is an umbrella term. And you can see back in 2019 and actually right up until 2022, Ireland had just over 2% of its waters designated as a marine protected area. And in this last couple of years, it has made great progress actually, and credit where credit is due. Ireland has increased the designation of MPAs from that just over 2% to just over 9%. And you can see that on the map on the right. You can see bigger blocks of green, including those two really big chunks of offshore SACs off the northwest and also off the south coast. But there has been others in the Irish Sea and off the coast of Wexford, and also extensions. There has been several extensions to existing SPAs around our coast as well, which makes up that just over 9%. However, when we start to think about the quality of our MPAs, then the progress is less encouraging, either recently or historically. So regarding our Natura 2000 network at sea, or SACs and SPAs in the marine environment, site-specific conservation objectives, management plans, and the conservation measures in those sites to bring qualifying interests and features to favourable or good condition are often lacking. Ireland does not have a good track history when it comes to managing our SACs and SPAs adequately. So much so that the EU Commission took a court case against Ireland a number of years ago, and last year the presiding judge ruled that ruled on side of the EU Commission and ruled that Ireland has systematically failed to implement adequate conservation measures in its Natura 2000 sites that was on land and at sea. So it was pretty damning. And I think that's evidence enough in itself, although there's lots more out there, I'm sure, that we could speak to, that a paradigm shift is needed in how we designate and implement new MPAs in Ireland, and a paradigm shift in how we manage our current suite of sites is needed in Ireland too. And while we, fail, I guess, to manage our sites properly that we have, and why we fail to pass legislation that would allow us to designate new sites through this new MPA bill, marine biodiversity continues to decline. That's what we must keep in mind all year on year, month on month, day to day. Threats and pressures increase, and this is just national and regional and international reports, studies, assessments, and they're all on different things, and they all have a different angle, and they're all speaking maybe to various different audiences. But all these reports, to sum up, if you were to sum them up, say, along the same lines, the same thing, that marine biodiversity and marine biodiversity trends are in a worrying decline on many fronts. Not all, certainly not all, but on many fronts, marine biodiversity is not doing well compared to even decades ago, never mind historically and hundreds of years ago. And we need to do something about it. So it's we often say it about the climate emergency, the time is running out, but it's equally true of the biodiversity emergency as well, and equally true again when we were speaking about biodiversity at sea. So how does Ireland plan to fulfill its 30 by 30 MPA commitments? So this is where the new forthcoming MPA legislation comes in. Unfortunately, back in 2020, Ireland's Programme for Government stated that the current coalition government will develop comprehensive legislation for the identification, designation and management of marine protected areas. So that's really good. That means that it's on the government's to-do list and work list. And does it, the question that prompts then, can Ireland's new MPA legislation be this paradigm shift needed to properly protect nature at sea? We certainly hope so, and we certainly believe it needs to be. And the timeline for the Ireland's new MPA legislation, so as I mentioned, back in 2020, the government commissioned an independent MPA advisory group report, and they published the report then, expanding Ireland's MPA network, a fantastic piece of work, really comprehensive, that kind of kicked things off, I guess, in terms of next steps. There was a consultation on that report the following year, and at the end of 2022, the general scheme for the proposed MPA bill, the new legislation, was published. So the general scheme, also sometimes called the heads of bill, I describe it as a fleshed out contents page. It's indicative. It's like an indicative outline of what the government intend the bill to do and to provide for. So it's kind of just like an outline. It doesn't give all the detail, but it gives an outline of what they intend to do. That general scheme underwent pre-legislative scrutiny in early 2023, and Fair Seas fed into that process. And the Housing, Local Government and Heritage Joint Oireachtas Committee published the report then with 45 recommendations of how the bill could be improved and how it should proceed. And since then, so that was the beginning, like March time last year, and since then there has been a disappointingly and a frustratingly lack of progress in terms of the bill being published. That it's still not published, and we're still waiting on it. And Fair Seas have been pushing as hard as we can in that interim time, and as of yet to no avail, unfortunately. And time is running out in terms of not just the grander existential question of the biodiversity and climate emergency, but time is running out for this government as well, because the general election is looming, be it in November, as a lot of people seem to think, in just a few months' time, or at the very latest it'll be February next year. So we have a willing government at the minute. They keep telling us at least that they're committed to doing this, and they have done a lot of work in this. In fairness, behind the scenes, we know that there's been a lot of work by the department and the minister to get this bill ready for publication, but it hasn't happened yet. So what will 2024 bring? Will it bring the bill being will the bill be published this year? I think it's possible. I don't think it's for certain, but I think from what we understand it's certainly possible. But will we have time then, once published, for it to go through the legislative process and be signed into law after proper debate and scrutiny in Ireland's upper and lower houses of Parliament, the Seanad and the Dáil? Probably not. That is probably will be a process that will likely have to be finished next year, potentially with a new government. And then after all that, once we have the bill, and we will get it eventually, there's the implementation of it, which is, and the passing and enacting of the bill is really only the first step. It's been a long journey, and we're not there yet with the enacting of this bill. It's not even published yet, but when we do get there, it will just be the end of the first step, really. So there's still a long journey ahead on this. So the last couple of slides now, just to try and answer this question: is Ireland on its way to 30% MPAs by 2030? I think the answer is yes. I think Ireland has never been in a better position to achieve its 30 by 30 commitments. We have a willing government and proactive ministers. How much longer those ministers will be in place, I'm not sure, but we work with what we have at the moment for sure, and that's been positive. There's huge public support, and that has been demonstrated time and time again in Ireland for MPAs. The new legislation is forthcoming, not at the pace we would like, and the bill isn't published yet, but we know it is being progressed and it is being drafted at the moment, and that's not nothing. And we have an opportunity to learn lessons from other countries as well. We're kind of late to the party with this national legislation to allow countries to designate national MPAs. So we can learn lessons from others about what they've done well and what hasn't worked so well. So in theory, if we do it right and we learn those lessons, we can actually make some great strides relatively quickly in the MPA and positive conservation and healthy seas outcomes that we want more broadly. But we can slightly tweak that question and ask a similar but subtly different question and say, is Ireland on its way to effectively protecting 30% of its seas for nature within this 30 by 30 target? And the answer to that is actually, I think more honestly, we don't know yet. Despite the positive momentum that I've just described, that the content and the timeframes of the new legislation are still unknown, apart from what was in the general scheme, which was published nearly 2 years ago now. We don't know a whole lot about the detail. The implementation of a new act, when we do get it, and we might get into that soon, takes time. We're starting from a low base, as I mentioned earlier. There's an increasing demand for sea space, and what springs to mind there is Ireland's burgeoning offshore renewable energy industry and ambition for offshore renewable energy industry in Ireland. And as mentioned, there is a general election looming, and we don't know what the new government will look like, and we don't know what the new government's priorities will be. And yet, I still think it's true to say Ireland has never been in a better position to live up to the letter and the spirit of its 30 by 30 commitment. So that's the quality and the quantity aspect that I mentioned earlier, to really, truly protect nature at sea. So I think we can be ocean optimistic about Ireland's MPA journey over the next, let's say, 7 years, well, less, actually 6 years now, 5 and 6 years to 2030. And the very last slide is I just want to mention is that marine protected areas are really important, and they are a really important tool to achieve healthy, happy seas, as I sometimes describe it. But they're not a silver bullet either. There are many other things that we also need to work really effectively and work together and speak to each other and to cover all bases to ensure that Ireland's seas and the biodiversity in those seas recovers and is thriving. And just a few examples here, the EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive, we needed to deliver good environmental status, as they describe it. There's national legislation, the Wildlife Acts, that we need to work to protect some of our nationally important species as well. Nature restoration law that Grace just mentioned, full implementation of the Common Fisheries Policy and the nature conservation elements of the CFP, of which there are some. We need marine spatial planning to work well. We need good water quality, and we need to address pollution. And that's, that's kind of captured under to a point under the EU Water Framework Directive. So there are many more laws, regulations, and policies and strategies at all these different levels that we need to work together to effectively deliver the ultimate goal of healthy seas. And MPAs are a really important piece of that big puzzle, but they're certainly not the only piece. So Gurma Oguf, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. And shameless plug, we have a rally outside the Dáil Éireann, on the 20th of September from 12 to 2 p.m. We're going to make as much noise as possible. So if you're in Dublin or want to make a trip to Dublin to join us, then please do. All right, thank you, folks.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much, Donal, for that presentation. We're all much more informed now about how the designation process will happen, or how we hope it will happen, and some of the timelines there. So it's good to kind of remind people of those and what we're up against in a way. So great. A couple of questions have come in on the Q&A, which we'll get to. We've got till 7 anyway, so that will cover a few questions for sure. So thanks for the questions from the folks watching at home. And I might just sort of ask you a few questions as well myself, responding to the talks. And for you first, Donal, you mentioned the quality and the quality of the MPAs, and I think we can imagine the quantity is around the government actually just doing the designations, and the bill is important for that. But the quality, like, so what is effective protection? What does it look like? And Grace, obviously you could I'm sure you have an opinion on this too. You could jump in as well, but maybe we'll start with Donal. Like, what is that? Let's start off optimistically. What do we want to see? What is effective protection?
So really great question. And the answer is, there's no uniform answer to that question for me. That it very much depends on what the features are that you're trying to protect. It very much depends on that. It also depends on their condition, their starting off condition. Are they already in a really disastrous state? Are they already declined, from, what was 100% of their range at one stage? Are they now down to just a proportion of that? It also depends on what pressures are limiting their survival, or what pressures and threats are impacting on their productivity, or their health and happiness, as I sometimes say. So there's no one answer to that question. But what I would say is that if we take it by a case-by-case basis, which I think is a reasonable way to approach MPAs actually, is that we have to make sure that any of those pressures or threats that we know are going to impact on those features or qualifying interests, or whatever we want to call it, those habitat species or services, ecosystem services, any threats or pressures to those that are going to impact on them negatively need to be managed. And the extent to which they're managed needs to also be addressed. So in some cases, I can imagine managing those threats and pressures is like prohibition, like a ban, like remove them completely. In others, I think if you have some good arguments and good evidence, then maybe lower levels of some activities may be allowed, and I think that's also fair. So there's a lot of when I see it, there's lots of dials, and for each MPA you'll have to move some dials up and down depending on, again, what the features are and what pressures there are and what condition things are in. But what I would also say is that I think Fair Seas are also advocating for 10% of Ireland seas to be strictly protected, and that's where all human activities that are potentially damaging on the ecosystem and the biodiversity in that area are removed. And only extremely low levels of activity, human activities, are allowed. Let's say maybe like swimming, or which can also have some impact on disturbance, say for seals, or so it doesn't go without its impact either. That's not what I'm saying, but it just extremely low level impact activities might be allowed, like maybe paddling and swimming or these sorts of things. And I think those areas are really important. They're like the top tier of environmental protections that we can afford. And those might be afforded to areas that are really pristine, that we really want to like protect and conserve, or they may be areas that are really, being like in really dire straits that we want to help improve. But I think 10%, of Ireland seas strictly protected is quite reasonable. It's achievable. It's still a big ask, but it is reasonable and achievable. And I think it should definitely be a part of the conversation when the government then, begin the official MPA process of designating these new MPAs before 2030. And I think that those areas, we can also learn from those areas as well, almost as a different meaning, but those reference areas of like what recovery looks like. Like if we actually leave the environment or ecosystems or specific species, we actually leave them alone, truly leave them alone, and just let them recover. Like, wait, how quick does that happen? How quickly do they recover? How well do they recover? And then that also then starts to feed into information, into questions of like, well, can we help these ecosystems, or can we help these habitats, or can we help these species in some way actively to help them along on their recovery, which then kind of verges into the work of the nature restoration law. But Grace, over to you. I don't know what your views on that.
Yeah, no, everything that you said there, having the strict protection is extremely important because it is passive restoration, and it's been shown that that's one of the best ways to effectively restore marine habitats, and as well to ensure that we are going to have these well-managed marine protected areas. It needs to be very clearly defined what needs to be protected in each site. Like you said, there's not a one size fits all. So we need to know what is going to be protected, exactly how it's going to be protected. So how are we going to do that? And then very importantly, who's in charge of doing it as well. So it can't just be a case of, the buck is kind of getting passed between people. It needs to be very, very clear what government bodies and what organizations are in charge of monitoring the areas to ensure that all of the actions are taking place.
Great, yeah, and maybe Grace, just that concept of restoration there. So passive restoration is one way, and then just to maybe clarify for people listening, what's the other sort of alternative? So maybe just expand a little bit on when we say restoration, the nature restoration law is calling for this restoration. Maybe just a little bit on what that actually looks like or could look like.
Yeah, so restoration, so it's basically bringing back habitats that are in like a degraded status. So bringing it back to good environmental status. And within the marine section of the nature restoration law, this refers back to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So that's bringing the areas back so that they are ecologically diverse, they're healthy, they're productive. And the different ways that we can measure that, even through the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, there's 11 different indicators. And these are parameters to measure good environmental status by. So that would be things like, the biodiversity, food webs, like the integrity of the food webs, seafloor integrity, invasive species pollution, different things like that. And then the different ways to bring these ecosystems back to that. Again, it will depend very much so on the different ecosystems. Like passive restoration is very good for certain sensitive areas, like I said, marl and seagrass. But for other areas, you would have to do active restoration. And for the land-based targets of the nature restoration law, there's going to be a lot more active restoration. So actually having to go out and manage, peatlands and forests and things like that. There'd be less passive restoration in that regard. So in the marine area, active restoration would be, even like protecting reefs. There's different ways that you can restore reefs. You can plant seagrass by going out and like individually planting it. So different things like that. So it's all really going to depend on the different habitats.
Okay. And the nature restoration law seems to have sort of plugged a lot of gaps there for us in the European context. Like your presentation was really interesting. It outlined all these amazing habitats, like the marl beds and even the seaweed beds that are hugely important. And also some poor species that missed out the last time around with the Habitats Directive, like those elasmobranchs. So it certainly sounds very positive as long as we just do it and resource it. And on that front, I'll just come around to a couple of the questions in the Q&A before we maybe work back towards the end of the session and what people can do and stuff that's coming up. There's a question there about what countries are exemplary. And, I suppose both of you could maybe touch on this. We have a lot of work to do, and we're kind of a bit behind other countries, but maybe that gives us the opportunity to look at best practice. So maybe in terms of restoration and in terms of designation, maybe both of you could come in. We'll just do the same, I suppose. We'll go back to Donal and then Grace. So which countries are exemplary when it comes to MPAs, and we'll open it up to maybe restoration too.
It's another really good question, and this is something that we look at quite a lot because we try to advocate for best practice, best international practice, and ways of governing and implementing MPAs. And my take on that is that there are very few exemplary countries when it comes to MPAs, but there are many exemplary MPAs in lots of different countries. So, okay. So the one country I will give honourable mention to is New Zealand, as one of the kind of the forerunners or the godfathers of MPAs, having designated their first MPAs like over 50, 70 years ago now, and done it in what seems now at least a very progressive way, even back then. But there, as I said, a lot of countries have some MPAs that work well and others that don't, and there's lots of reasons for that. But what I would say is some of the best case or models or the best practice examples that we talk about, they are normally, they do have things in common. Like, for example, I used to work a lot in the UK and over in England, and we would speak a lot about Lyme Bay down in the south coast of England. And that was because the local community there, particularly the local fishing community, came together with conservation NGOs, and that was a bottom-up MPA, and the fishing community were completely on board, as were the wider coastal community there, and they self-regulated almost, and it was initially a voluntary MPA and then it became statutory. There's another example up in Scotland that I visited a few years ago, actually, on the Isle of Arran, Lamlash Bay, that again was the local community, including the fishing community, came together and said, this is an area of scallop fishing that we think should be preserved, that will then preserve our own way of life and fishing community there. And that was a voluntary thing and then became a statutory thing. And actually the statutory MPA and management covered a much more larger area in the end. And there's similar stories in the north of Spain and along the Galician coast and in Portugal, of really well managed marine protected areas that have the full support of the local community. So that's why in Fair Seas Advocacy that we speak a lot about the way the stakeholder engagement, the involvement, the participation of local communities and local industry and sectors and people. That's really important aspect of. It's not just the right thing to do morally, ethically, is to include people in these really important decisions about their area and the area that they use recreationally or gain their livelihoods from. But it's actually the best thing to do for environmental outcomes as well, because when you bring people along, the evidence from all around the world shows that that marine protected area is better complied with in terms of the regulation management that you introduce. There's a sense of civic pride and, you know, responsibility for it that grows within the coastal community. So they actually begin to look after it, to seek for opportunities to improve it, and to manage it and to police it. And it's much more effective when that's come from the coastal community as opposed to being brought in from top down. So there are lots of examples. I'll pass over to Grace now, but there are lots of examples, but they do have a thread in my eyes, and that is that bottom up sensibility to it, which I think we should try to promote in Ireland.
Yeah, and we need to resource that as well, because that involves boots on the ground and people out there engaging with the community. So that's important to we resource that properly. Yeah, Grace, did you have anything? Did you want to come in there at all?
Yeah, basically, you know, reiterating what Donal said, you know, no country is perfect, but there are really good examples around the world, and you know, countries are constantly learning. Looking at a bit closer to home, so even in the north of Ireland, you know, bottom trawling, which is a kind of destructive fishing method, where big weighted nets are dragged along the sea floor and they end up destroying everything in its path. They're very indiscriminate in the fish that they catch as well. But bottom trawling is allowed in most MPAs, but in the north of Ireland, it's actually been banned from quite a few. And I know that Scotland is actually bringing in, it's bringing forth plans to have bottom trawling banned in some of its offshore marine protected areas as well. So this is something that we can learn from in the Republic. That, you know, we need to look at destructive fishing practices as well within our marine protected areas, and sort of follow suit from our friends in the north and in Scotland.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for that example, Grace. And that actually brings us to a couple of questions in the chat, like referenced, you know, trawling. And one person has asked very clearly, is trawling illegal? Or no, is illegal trawling occurring? But I think maybe be better to ask, is trawling even illegal in MPAs? Maybe Grace, you could sort of speak a little bit about the current situation with trawling in MPAs in Ireland, because it's probably something that people aren't always aware of.
Yes, so in Ireland at the moment, no, trawling isn't illegal. There are a few small areas that, you know, trawling has been restricted. So this has been done through fisheries Natura declarations, which was one of the things I spoke about in my presentation, and how ways to, you know, effectively hit our targets. But some of these areas are extremely small. Like there's one in Dundalk Bay, and it's about 2 kilometers squared where trawling is restricted. So, you know, it's really not enough. So trawling isn't illegal, it can occur. And then it did used to be illegal within the 6 nautical mile limit around Ireland. Vessels over 18 meters were not allowed to trawl within it. And this was a really, you know, NGOs sort of advocated for this for a long time. Whenever this came into force, you know, everyone was delighted. And then unfortunately it got overturned due to 2 fishermen putting in complaints about it. So you might have seen we kind of ran a small campaign earlier this year, because there was another public consultation trying to get this ban back in place. So we submitted to that because we believe that, you know, trawling shouldn't be occurring within the 6 nautical mile zone, because it is such an important ecological zone. You know, there's a lot of juvenile fish nursery areas. There's a lot of spawning that goes on there. So this has a knock-on effect to the entire food web and to lots of different industries. Not it's obviously very ecologically damaging, but it has an economic effect as well to the fishing industry, and also to sort of wildlife operators as well, you know, like whale watching tours and things like that. Because whales' food sources like sprat and fish like that is getting taken out in these massive numbers. So hopefully trawling will be illegal again very soon in our 6 nautical mile zone. Yeah, we are patiently waiting to hear what the results of that consultation is going to be.
Yeah, the decision is based on that consultation by the minister. It's really important. Deadly. Okay, so we're getting short on time, and we'll start working towards the end. So there's a nice question in here. It's pretty succinct. And it's towards Donal, but because it's about the bill itself. But others feel free to chip in as well, Grace, if you like. But it's, what do you see as the obstacles / resistance to publishing the Marine Protected Areas Bill? That's a question coming in from Mihal there.
Thank you, Mihal. I'm glad you're listening in this evening. And yes, I do have significant patience, and you need it because we were first promised this bill, as you well know, Michal, back in over 2 years ago now. And then the deadline has been pushed and slipped and pushed and slipped again, and we're still haven't got it. So what are the obstacles? I think at the minute, we're told, and I believe, that there is no political opposition to the bill. We've been told, and I believe, that there is cross-party government coalition party support for this bill. I think the obstacle now is, I guess, two things. Is that it's time. I mean, if you had asked me this question last year, it might have been different, but where we are at the minute, it's time, because we know that there's a general election coming soon. My betting is that it's going to be in early November. And that means that even if the bill is ready to be published in the next few weeks, the Dáil returns next week. If it's published even on the first day of the Dáil returns next Wednesday, if there is a general election at the beginning of November, that's probably not enough time for the bill to go through full scrutiny and debate, and that we want to see proper scrutiny and debate in their Oireachtas before passing into law before that general election comes around. And then if it isn't passed into law before the general election comes around, no matter when the general election is, either this year or early next year, the obstacles then is, well, is it the MPA bill a priority for the new government? Is it on their programme for government at all? And even if it is on the programme for government, is it a true priority in their government? Because the MPA bill is a priority for this current government. It's in their programme for government, but it's only become a true priority, and maybe it's not even that, but it's only become close to a true priority right in the very, dying ember days of their 5-year mandate. So, and that tells you something as well. So they could have done this. There's been a lot of fantastic work, don't get me wrong, but the prioritization of this bill over other also important bills, but the prioritization of environmental bills over other types of bills is not easy. So those are the types of obstacles I think we have at the minute. And so it's time, and the other more process, I guess, process-driven obstacle, I think, is that the government and the same department, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, which has responsibility for the MPA bill, is also trying to push through the Planning and Development Bill. For right or for wrong, I know a lot of NGOs have a problem with that as well. I don't work on it specifically, so I won't comment on that. But it's a huge bill. It's I think it's a beast of a bill. I think it's one of the largest that the state has ever progressed. And that takes up capacity. So like a really boring obstacle, but actually a really important one. And we believe that because it's in the dying days of this government, we know that the government are trying to push through lots of different bills that at the last chance saloon kind of thing. And that takes up time for the parliamentary drafters of legislation, which is an issue we understand and has been an issue over the past 6 months. But that makes it sound a bit pessimistic, but it's actually a good thing that those are the types of obstacles that we're facing now, as opposed to it being a political impasse, because that would just put it dead in the water. There is still hope here. As I said, we can be ocean optimistic with this. But that's not to say that it's a given either. We're going to push as hard as we can as Fair Seas. That's why we're having a rally outside the Dáil on the 25th. But they can be overcome. And either in the lifetime of this government or the next. And as long as that political impasse doesn't appear at any stage, either in this government or the next, then I'm not worried that we will get it done. It's when there is political within government opposition to something, that's when I will be really starting to worry about the fate of the Ireland's MPA new legislation.
Okay, so there is maybe not political opposition, but political prioritization has certainly been somewhat lacking in the last 5 years.
Well,
Yeah.
absolutely. And now towards the end, then it forces the government to reprioritize again, almost.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Okay, so well, I suppose I'll finish then by saying, like, certainly when it comes to political prioritization, the voice of the people can help put things higher up on the agenda. So the Irish Wildlife Trust has always had that opinion, and we've got a history of trying to inform the public and our followers and our members about issues and get them involved in the campaigning. So what can people do? You mentioned, and this is for both Grace and Donal. What can people do to try and support this movement to get better ocean protection, to get the bill over the line? Maybe one example from each of you to finish on would be great. I think, and Donal, if your example is not the rally, maybe just remind us of the rally one more time, of the date and the time and the place, and how people can find out more.
No worries, brilliant. I will certainly do that. So it's a rally for Ireland Seas. It's outside the Dáil on the 25th of September. It starts at noon. It goes on for finishes at 2. That's Wednesday, the 25th of September. Bring your banners, bring your snorkels, bring your wetsuit, dress up as a shark or a puffin. Some of us will be, so you'll be in good company. And it's really to what Kieran said there, to reprioritize the government's prioritization, is to push the MPA bill up the agenda as much and as far as we can. And as I say, the last months and weeks of potentially of this government. And there's also, if you go on our Twitter or on social media channels, you will see petition there you can sign as well that will do the same thing. But there's nothing like having a bunch of loud marine conservationists outside Dáil gates to grab their attention. So please do come along.
Yeah, well, the Irish Wildlife Trust will be there, and we're putting the word out to our community as well. So yeah, thanks for that, Donal. And yeah, Grace, maybe last word for you in terms of things people can do other than coming to the rally to help sort of support this movement and the push to get proper protection for marine life in Ireland finally.
Yes, so like Donal said, the Fair Seas have their petition, which you can find on sort of any of our social media or on our websites. And then aside from that, there are sort of bigger actions that people can take whenever, to do with the nature restoration law, member states have got 2 years to draft their national restoration plans. Now, it does state within the law that there should be, open and transparent public participation within this. So there are going to be consultations, reaching out to the public to ask for their opinions and thoughts on what needs to be done in order to hit our targets. So we'll be sharing information about that. Keep an eye out for any of these public consultations and be able to use your voice to put in, what you think is important, what should be prioritized so that we could get really, really good measures in place so we can restore our ecosystems.
Indeed, thank you. Yeah, and that's an important getting back to the NRL. That's an important element of it that we didn't really have time to talk about tonight. But the nature restoration plan now needs to be created by our nation to show how we're going to come do all this great work, and there'll be opportunities for public consultation in that process. So the Irish Wildlife Trust will keep you informed if you're on our mailing list. That's one way to keep informed about those consultations and any other interesting consultations. Okay, so because of lack of time, we'll wrap it up there. There's a few questions we didn't get around to, but I think that was a really good look at the nature restoration law and a bit of the emerging detail there now that it's finally over the line and we're starting to get to know it. So thank you, Grace, for educating us on that. And thanks, Donal, for bringing us up to speed on really where we stand with this really important bill and the sort of history of how we got here and what needs to be done. So yeah, Grace Carr of the Irish Wildlife Trust and Donal Griffin from Fair Seas. Thank you for your time this evening. And thank you everybody who listened in and watched the webinar, and thank you for the questions. The webinar, as usual, will be recorded and posted to the Irish Wildlife Trust YouTube channel, where you can find all our other webinars as well if you want to catch up on other wildlife issues and ideas. Okay, so with that, I'll say thank you to everybody, and we'll chat to you all again soon, hopefully, and we'll keep an eye out for you outside the gates of Dáil Éireann shortly. So thanks, Donal, and thanks, Grace, and good night, everybody. Talk to you all again soon.
See you, folks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.